Hi there. So in this video, we'll cover some tips and strategies for the LR section. So without further ado, let's get started. So first thing, we want to know what to look for. So for the most part, LR is divided into four main buckets, and we can think of those buckets as arguments, inference, paradox, and point of issue. Arguments is the bread and butter of the LSAT. It covers around 90% of the questions, and they cover many different flavors. So you might see flaw questions, conclusion questions, strengthen questions, weaken questions, assumption questions, principle questions. There's a host of them. But once again, they're the most common and they're the ones you want to focus on for the most part. So no matter what type of argument you're facing, whether it's a flaw question or conclusion question, you always first want to try to understand what's going on. And in order to understand what's going on, first you want to find the conclusion, and then you want to find the evidence or the premises that lead to the conclusion. And once you have a good understanding of what's going on, then you could tackle it and look at the possible answers. Conversely, inference questions are a little bit different, and they come in a couple different flavors. So they might be must be true, what can be inferred, most strongly supported. And for these, there are no conclusion. Basically, there's a bunch of facts, and from these facts, you basically need to figure something out. So in other words, you're almost trying to find the conclusion from these facts. So once again, inference questions, almost always they have no conclusion. Maybe occasionally they do, but for most part, no. Next up, we have paradox questions. And for these, once again, no conclusion either. And for these, basically something weird is occurring, and the correct answer explains it. Finally, we have point of issue. And these are pretty easy to tell because basically when you have two people, so you have one position, second position, and basically the question asks you what they agree about or what they disagree about, and it could be broad or specific. So they might disagree in, let's say, in their conclusions, or alternatively, they might agree on their conclusions, but maybe the specifics is the part on which they disagree. So the next question you might be asking is like, how do you determine what you're dealing with? And the LSAT could be difficult. It could be very tricky, but in this instance, they're actually pretty nice. They do tell you in the question stem, and I'll show you some examples to show you what to look for. So here's some examples for arguments. Which one of the following, if true, weakens the argument? Which one of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? Which one of the following most logically completes the argument? And if you notice in all three examples, they mention the word argument. So if they mention the word argument, well, there's an argument. And if there's argument, once again, you want to find the conclusion, the evidence, and try to understand what's going on. Next up, we have inference questions. So we can see three examples over here. Which one of the following can be properly inferred from the statements above? If the information above is true, then which of the following must be true? The statements above, if true, provides the most support for which one of the following? And it should be pretty clear, but if you look at these, you could see they don't mention the word argument. Instead, they say either statements or information. And that's because there is no argument. There's no evidence. It's just a bunch of facts. And from these facts, and your job is basically to figure something out, to do something, infer something from these set of facts. And finally, we have the last two. So paradox. Which one of the following helps to resolve the paradox described above? Which answer below would explain the discrepancy shown in the example? It should be noted that paradox and discrepancy is fundamentally the same thing. So they're not different types of questions, they're just synonyms. So they mean the same thing. Sometimes they use the word paradox, sometimes they use discrepancy, but once again, same idea. And this is to drive the point across. A quick example of a paradox question would be like something of the sort. He eats at McDonald's 7 days a week, yet he's skinny. So that's a little bit paradoxical because if he eats there so much, you think he would be heavier or obese, something of the sort. So some possible correct answers might be, well, he's in exercise zealot. He exercises a lot, so he burns it away. Maybe he only eats salads over there. Or maybe he just eats in moderation. Who knows, but you're just looking for something that explains this discrepancy. Last, we have point of issue. So we have two people, Sarah, Ralph. And here we can see what they disagree about. And pretty much that's what they're going to ask you, what they agree or disagree. And that's it for this first tip. So nothing too complex, pretty basic stuff, but it's a good idea to get a handle on what the LSAT's asking you and know the different type of questions. And at least from here, you'll know like, okay, for this type of question, I need to find a conclusion. While for this question type, I do not because there isn't one. So now we have tip 2 with quantifiers. So maybe this is a new word, or maybe it's not. So the word isn't really too important. It's more about the concept. But if you notice, quantifiers sort of sound like the word quantity, and that's pretty much what it means. So it quantifies something from a certain degree from 0% to 100%. And these words are very helpful to understand arguments and other question types on the LR section. and also is very helpful for the RC section, reading comprehension. So at one end of the spectrum, we have 0%, very extreme. So these would be words like no, none, lax, never, not, possible. And in the middle, we have some keywords. So we have some, and some this means at least one. It could mean more than one. It might even mean the majority, but at the very least, it has to be at least one. We have not all, which means there's one that's not part of it. We have most, which is more than 50%. So for example, if we have 100 and we said most, it will have to be at least 51. Many is a little bit open-ended. It can mean as little as, let's say, 3. It can mean as much as 3,000. Depends on the situation. And then we have seldom and probably. And there's also other words to be mindful of. This is not exhaustive. It's not every possible quantifier, but just some to give you an idea of what they look like. And finally, we have the other extreme. So these would be words like any, all, each, always, and if. And if might be a little bit peculiar, but it's a term that's absolute. We could think of an example. If I said all dogs are good, that means if you're a dog, then you're good. So you can see the conditional and all is the same idea. So now we'll look at an example problem to see how these words are very helpful. A scientist claimed that extraterrestrial life does not exist, arguing that in his entire career of astronomical research, he had never observed any evidence of alien life. So in this case, we could see two quantifiers, the not and never. And if we reduce this argument, even though it's pretty simple, into something even simpler, it basically states these aliens do not exist. Why? Because they've never been observed. So we want to cover this not and never. So let's say they ask you find an argument that's similar. So we have this example, this possible answer choice. After years of working as a lifeguard, Jamie concluded that ocean waves are seldom dangerous, reasoning that he had never witnessed anyone seriously injured by a wave. So this possible answer choice is in fact incorrect. So it's very close to the initial argument, but one word makes all the difference, and that one word is seldom. So seldom means rarely. It's close to not, but not exactly the same. Not is very extreme, 0%. So seldom leaves the chance that something could occur, but we want something very absolute. On the other hand, they do have the never at the end, so that does match up. But once again, that one word seldom makes all the difference. So you always want to be lookout for these words. So how they're utilized could be a little bit different from this example, but nonetheless, you should always think about them. They're very impactful, and sometimes you want something strong, sometimes you want something weak. It depends on the situation, but once again, you want to think about them. Next idea is closely related words. And this is a trap they often play on the LSAT. So they have two words that are very similar, and they try to equate them. And treating them as the same thing is the issue, pretty much. Because although they might be closely related, they're technically not exactly the same thing. So we can see some examples of here, like a falcon and a hawk. So let's say they have a strengthened question, something to do with falcons, and one of the answers does seem to work out, except they mention a hawk instead of falcon. And for that one reason, it could potentially be incorrect because it's talking about a different type of bird. Even though it's very similar, it could be not what they want. It could be a little trap they played for you. And then we have some other examples like meteorite and asteroid. So very similar, but once again, not the same thing. A celebrity and actor, and a bee and wasp. So these are some words that you could think about. But now we'll look at a more detailed example, something a little bit more complex. And if you'd like, you could pause the video, read it over. And what you're looking for in this example is two words that are very similar, but technically they're not the same, but they're equating the two terms. So once you're ready, unpause the video and we'll go over it. Okay, so the two words or two phrases is weight loss and body fat. So if you read this a little bit too quickly, you might not notice a difference, but there is a difference. Because weight loss could mean many things. It could, or most likely, mean body fat, but it could also mean other things. Maybe you're losing protein, maybe you're losing like muscle mass, maybe you're losing water weight. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're losing body fat. And that's the issue with this. So this is a flawed argument. And once again, you always want to think about words that are very similar, but are not exactly the same. So every word counts. Think about what you're reading, think about the subject, the terms, the major concepts, and if they go from one point to another point and they're not exactly the same. Next, we have the idea of scope. And we have an example on the screen, but before we go over that, I just want to explain what we mean by scope. So basically, scope is how broad or specific a claim is, and these claims could be in the answers or the initial argument, or also the stimulus. Maybe it's a set of facts instead of an argument. So depending on the situation, we might want something broad in the answers or something specific. So for example, if we have a strengthened question, and their conclusion states that all dogs are good, and let us say one of the answer states that golden retrievers are good. So that's very specific. So that would help the argument, but not too much. On the other hand, if there was another answer choice that has very broad scope, such as all pets are good, or any animal with four legs is good, you can see that helps the argument to a much bigger degree. So with that said, now we'll look at the example on screen. And the example is the inverse of the example that we just did with the strengthened question. So for this case, we're looking for something more specific. So we have Ralph. In my view, switching to electric vehicles would help lower pollution in urban areas. Electric vehicles produce fewer emissions than traditional gasoline engines. So the first sentence is the conclusion, and now we have Susan. I disagree. Battery powered cars have limited ranges and need frequent recharging. If widely adopted, they would increase demand for electricity from power plants, which are themselves significant sources of pollution. Next, we have the question stem. Which one of the following, if true, would best allow Ralph to counter Susan's argument? And if you look below, we have one possible answer. The additional air pollution from higher electricity demand would be balanced by the decrease in emissions from electric vehicles. And at a quick glance, this answer seems pretty good. It addresses the pollution issue. It directly addresses Susan's point. Yet, with that said, it actually is incorrect. This would be a trap answer. And the reason is basically we could think of scope once again. So, if we go back to Ralph and find his conclusion, at the very end of it says lower pollution in urban areas. And the key word is urban. So we're not talking about lowering pollution for the entire world or other specific regions, pretty much just this one region, urban areas. And when we focus on that aspect, this answer choice at the bottom doesn't address that issue because it's talking about air pollution in general terms, but we want something more specific. So once again, always think about scope. And there's no quick and easy heuristic. So it's not that broad answers are better or specific answers are better. It all depends on the situation. It's something you have to recognize. So when you're reading through some source material, just think about how specific or broad the information is and try to decipher what you're looking for. And finally, we have our last tip, deciding between two answers. So the first thing to think about is every word counts. So let's say you're between answer choice A and B. You want to read both answers very carefully and think about every word. Think if there's any words that are different between those two answer choices, and often one word can make all the difference. You might see some word that we mentioned previously, like a quantifier, and that might make, let's say, A correct rather than B. So that's the first step, but the error might not be between the two answers. Maybe there's some misunderstanding in your initial pass of the stimulus. So if looking between every word of two possible answer choices doesn't work, what we need to do is forget about the answers and go back to the initial argument and read it super slowly because often the issue is you didn't understand it 100% correctly. So if you have 90% understanding of it, that's not good enough for the LSAT because for the LSAT, it's a very precise test. If you have ever heard of the phrase read the fine print, pretty much that's what they're testing on the LSAT because they're training you to be future lawyers and to understand contracts. So what happens is when you read initially, maybe you have 95% understanding, but if you go back and reread it super slowly and have 100% understanding of what's going on, you might see a word that you missed initially that you glossed over. And now that you know that word, everything makes sense. And you're like, oh, yes, A is the correct answer and not B. If you understand the initial stimulus or argument perfectly, 100% accuracy, then the correct answer will become basically obvious. It'll be like, duh. And that leaves us with our final tip is basically be a turtle. So there's the old tale of the tortoise versus the hare, and ultimately the turtle won. Why? Because slow and steady wins the race. And it might be paradoxical, but by going slower, you can actually go faster. When you read slowly and carefully, you see every little nuance, every distinction between different ideas and concepts. And when you do this, the correct answer reveals itself. It becomes a lot more apparent, and you could do the questions and answers a lot more quickly and efficiently. On the other hand, if you read too quickly, you might miss something, and then you spend a lot of time deciding between two or possible three answer choices, and that eats up a lot of time. And since you're deciding between these two, you might have to go back and reread the initial stimulus, which also wastes a lot of time. And in the end, by reading quickly, you might actually lose more time. So, in conclusion, read slowly, carefully, think about every word, some words we mentioned, think about the scope, think about quantifiers, and that's it. The strategies outlined in this video are broad and not specific to any question type, but there's something that is applicable to all material on LSAT, whether it's the LR section, which we focus on, but also the RC section. And finally, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.